I can't say I really believe in ghosts. I can't say I don't really believe either. After 7 decades, I've seen and heard enough to know things really do go bump in the night. Sometimes, actually most times, there's a perfectly logical and often quite obvious explanation for those bumps. On the other hand, there are some bumps that have absolutely no explanation, logical, obvious, or otherwise. Why? Because we simply don't know what is really going on. After all, hundreds of centuries ago, we thought the sun and the moon and all the stars circled around the earth. Even sillier yet, we thought the earth was flat. Why? Because we didn't know what was really going on. We simply did not know better. When I was a child, my family lived in an old farmhouse built sometime around the War for Independence. Even 70 years ago, it was old, very old. Like most houses that age, summer heat would make its ancient timbers expand, and the cool nights would make them contract. Both actions would give off a haunting symphony of creaks and thumps and groans. Winter winds, in a different way, would cause the same ghostly noises. During the day, it wasn't noticed so much, but at night, late at night, when the TV and the radio were off, when the family was asleep, all those phantom sounds were dramatically magnified by this young boy's overactive imagination. There were more fear-filled sleepless nights than I care to remember. As I grew older and more aware of the ways of old houses, after I learned what was really going on, I managed to get more sleep. And yet, there were still a few bumps and thuds and creaks and groans and moans and phantom footsteps and voices, yes, voices. Even to this day, decades later, no one in my family has ever been able to explain what was their worldly or ghostly source. One night during the early 60s, we had a good-sized social gathering of friends and family. At the end, as the last of the guests were leaving, they and all of my family were standing just inside the back door saying our goodbyes. As many conversations can sometimes go, there was a pause. We all went silent, but mysteriously, somewhere else in the house, another conversation could be heard, very briefly, before it too went silent. It wasn't an echo. The voices were noticeably different. It wasn't imagined. We all heard it. And there was no one else in the house. About 3 years later, on a weekend night, a night when my older brothers and I were out for the evening, my mother and father were awakened by the locked front door opening and loudly slamming shut. This was followed by loud footsteps stomping up the stairs, right past my parents' bedroom, across the hall, and into our bedrooms. My father angrily jumped out of bed, ran across the hall, ready to read the riot act to his 3 teenage sons. We weren't there. Just my baby brother, still a toddler, sound asleep. My father wasn't dreaming. My mother heard it too. No one else was there. The front door was still locked, and my brothers and I always came in the back door at night. Over the years, growing up in that old farmhouse, there were many other oddities, things like a shadow where one shouldn't be, a light that went on or off by itself, doors that opened or closed by themselves. There were so many, we simply brushed them off as something that, if carefully looked into, could be easily explained away. Or so we believed. By 1972, I had left home, got married, had a home of my own, and more or less put all those strange occurrences far away in the dusty back shelves of my mind. Over the following years, I would listen to others tell of their stories of ghosts and strange happenings. Many of their tales were, to say the least, interesting and most intriguing. However, as much as I wanted to believe them, I knew that without proof or proper investigation, they were no more than just tales, tall tales. Then, in the mid-90s, I acquired a part-time weekend job as a tour guide at the Brick House Museum in Orange County, New York. It was another colonial-era house similar in design to the old farmhouse I grew up in, just a few miles away. Every Saturday and Sunday morning from late spring to early fall, I would go through the procedure of unlocking the doors, opening the blinds, and turning on the lights of every room. I would inspect the condition and placement of every item in each room, to be sure all was well in the house. Throughout the day, several times, I would guide visitors throughout the house, describing its contents and its long history. Before long, I became thoroughly intimate with every room, every square inch, and every item in that ancient dwelling. I also became familiar with every sound, yes, every bump, thump, thud, creak, groan, and moan. All my spooky childhood memories came back. The brick house had its own ghostly mysteries. I was warned when I first began this job that things did go bump in the night there, but I shouldn't worry too much since I was only there during the day. But in between tours and on slow days, I was there alone. Perhaps I suffered from the powers of suggestion, but I often found myself chasing down noises throughout every floor and every room in that house. Thumps and groans and creaks were everywhere. If I was upstairs, they were downstairs. If I were downstairs, they were upstairs. Sometimes I would hear a loud crash in another part of the house and spent most of the day searching for what happened, and eventually find nothing. There were footsteps, too. Footsteps that sent me searching for unannounced visitors so often that I began locking the doors in between tours in order to know the difference between the living and the whoever. Most disturbing, or at least most puzzling, was one particular corner upstairs bedroom that was nicknamed the Icebox. During the summer months, without air conditioning and all the windows closed and locked, it got hot as hell in that house, except for that one bedroom. It was always noticeably cooler there. If that wasn't suspicious enough, the light in that room refused to stay off. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon, when it was closing time, I went through a very thorough and methodical procedure to close down the house. Each room had a list of things to be done. Blinds had to be closed, every item inspected, and every light shut off. Almost every time I opened the house back up the next day or next weekend, the light in that room would be on. I actually began coming back later at night to check on it, and more often than not, the light would be on. One afternoon, I gave a tour for my wife's family. Among them was her Aunt Frances. This particular lady was well known to the family as well as her whole neighborhood as a clairvoyant. She had a long storied history of it. Prior to the tour, I never mentioned anything to her about anything paranormal about the house. During the tour, I was careful to not even make the slightest hint of anything peculiar going on there. However, after the tour, she actually pulled me aside to tell me there was a very strong presence in that room, the Icebox. I knew that woman long enough, and I knew enough about her to know she wasn't just telling a tall tale. Finally, I have one last ghostly tale to tell. One frightening incident that happened in the brick house. One that is a telling example of understanding what is really going on when you know better. The Hill family, the former owners of the house, had a family legend of a ghost they called the Man in the Attic. In the upstairs hallway, there was a stairway that led up to the attic. Halfway up the stairway was a landing. On that landing was placed a spinning wheel. As part of the story goes, the man in the attic would sometimes come down out of the attic and run the spinning wheel. One day, a previous tour guide, a few years before me, was giving a tour and telling the story of the man in the attic. As they came up to the attic stairway, there was a spinning wheel spinning. I guess, not surprisingly, the tour group and tour guide all ran out of the house screaming. Next to the brick house is an old carriage house converted into a garage with an upstairs apartment. The man living there came out to see what all the screaming was about. When the screamers calmed down enough to explain to him what had happened, the skeptic tenant went into the house to investigate. Sure enough, he found the spinning wheel spinning away. But it wasn't the man in the attic guilty of causing the commotion. Somehow, a sparrow got into the house, upstairs, up the attic stairways, and onto a spoke of the spinning wheel. A playful little sparrow it was, having the grandest time on its newfound spinning perch. Yep, that's the thing about ghost stories. Sometimes you know what's going on, and sometimes you don't. Boo.